A recent report commissioned by Environment and Climate Change Canada got a lot of media coverage. The headlines read, Canada warmed twice as fast as the entire planet since 1948. Well, we're joined by Dr. Ross McKitrick, professor of economics at the University of Guelph. He recently wrote an article published in the Financial Post entitled, Hold the Panic, Canada just warmed 1.7 degrees and thrived. That is an alarming headline, Professor McKitrick, but you believe saying Canada warmed twice as fast as the whole planet doesn't actually prove anything?
Well, no, it doesn't. First of all, because we've long known that whenever you have a warming phase going on, regardless of the cause, the land warms faster than the oceans. 70% of the Earth's surface is ocean. So whatever land mass you pick is going to warm faster than the global average. And so if they'd looked at Russia or areas of the southern hemisphere even, they would have found the land areas warm faster than the global average because the average is pulled down by the oceans. Also, Canada is a northern country. Part of the Arctic is in our land mass. And another feature of the way the climate system works is the polar regions are supposed to warm faster than the lower latitudes. So that again pulls up the average for Canada. What it doesn't mean, though, is if anyone thinks that this means because we're a heavy emitter or that means we're more polluted, that's a complete misreading. And I think in that sense, for Environment Canada to keep headlining a statement like that, it almost invites a misinterpretation.
Right, yeah, because that's the implication. I think people just kind of bite on that just automatically, right? Now, if it were, and if it is true, if faster warming is happening in Canada, is that necessarily a bad thing for us here? I mean, again, with the winter we had here, we're kind of going, it sounds good, right?
Well, one of the points that I made in the article was that within Canada, there are some regions that warmed twice as fast as other regions, or even 3 times as fast. And wherever you live, chances are one season might have warmed twice as fast as another. And we hardly notice these things. In fact, if you're not sure whether spring or fall warmed faster for you wherever you live, if you wouldn't know unless you looked in the report. That just tells you how little it mattered to you over the years. Another perspective is to talk to an 80-year-old because they were entering their teens at the time these temperature records began, 1948. So from the 50s to the present, ask them what they experienced in their life. What were the changes that they lived through? And I'm sure they'll have a long list of things that they can talk about, of all the things that have changed. I really doubt they're going to highlight minor changes in the weather. But if they did, chances are they would say, it feels like winter's a bit shorter and less brutally cold than it used to be, and that's a good thing. I'm glad about that.
Right, so it's not necessarily a big negative. Okay. By the way, this climate change report was released on the very same day the government's new carbon tax regime came into effect in 4 provinces. So now that's probably just coincidence, right, Professor McKitrick?
Well, a lot of people pointed to that coincidence that the report was leaked on the same day as the carbon tax came into play. It came into place. Now, you can tell from the report they've been working on it a long time. So maybe they had always scheduled it for that particular day. But yeah, a lot of people found that suspicious.
Somewhat convenient, it would seem. Now, you write in your report a little bit about confirmation bias. What is that exactly and how does it work?
Well, confirmation bias arises when you have a certain idea in your head and you start just seeing evidence that confirms it. You are sort of tuned out of any evidence that may conflict with it, and you only really pay attention to things that confirm it. Now, we've been hearing from the government over and over for many, many years, for decades now, that climate change is happening and it's a hazardous, dangerous, terrible thing. And so what you see as far as confirmation bias goes is now anytime there's a bad storm, for instance, or if there's a hot day in the summer, then people say, oh, well, that's evidence of climate change, as if we didn't used to get thunderstorms and hot days in the summer, and as if there didn't used to be forest fires or things like that. So confirmation bias in a case like this arises. You hear it when politicians talk about the importance of climate policy because we have so many forest fires or we have extreme weather events. The obvious rejoinder there is we've always had forest fires and we've always had extreme weather events. To settle that, what you have to do is go and look at the data. Are we getting more forest fires than we used to? Are we getting more extreme weather events than we used to? And that's where the federal government's own data makes it clear that no, actually, we're not. The National Forest Service has data going back decades on forest fire rates in Canada. And at least since the 1990s, they've been trending down, not up. And as far as extreme weather goes, the new report from Environment Canada doesn't assert that we're seeing more extreme rainfall events or extreme precipitation events. And other data sets that Environment Canada has put out recently confirm that most cities across the country haven't seen any change. And to the extent there's a pattern, we actually have fewer heavy downpour events now than we did 20, 30 years ago.
That is fascinating. I think there is something to that confirmation bias as well. It reminds me of, when you buy a new car, and then suddenly you notice the same brand of car all over the place because it's new to you and you're looking for it.
Yeah,
so again, it's a
exactly
psychological effect, I think, right? Suddenly we notice it.
Yeah.
And those cars have been there the whole time, right? So now, when we have a really dry season, wet, cold, hot season, whatever it might be, is that the exception, again, or is it a trend? We talk about natural weather cycles that repeat themselves over the centuries. You mentioned the 80-year-old, so forth, going back to, over time. You point out last summer when the media hyped a report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, warning that 1.5 degrees of warming was a disaster threshold. And yet, the title of your article there, Canada has warmed 1.7 degrees since 1948, but, no panic, So did we miss something here?
Well, isn't that an interesting question? Last summer, we were told over and over, if you cross 1.5 degrees of warming compared to pre-industrial times, that will be a catastrophe. We have to avoid it at all costs. Now we're told, oh, we actually warmed 1.7 degrees just since 1948. Was it a catastrophe? Well, no, actually the country got a lot better off over that time. Our incomes have gone up, population's gone up, lifespan has gone up, health has improved. On every measure we have, things pretty much got better. So if that's a catastrophe, I only wish every catastrophe looked like that.
That's a good way to put it. Now, I think what seems to convince the public that this is alarm-worthy is that so many of the reports make claims that virtually all of the world's climate change scientists agree that the planet is warming up dangerously fast. So what do we do with that?
Well, what you do with that is you look at what the scientists, who was surveyed, first of all, and what they were actually asked. Now, the way you summarized it is the classic summary that 97% of the world's scientists believe climate's changing, it's a hazard, dangerous thing, and it's our fault. The surveys don't actually ask that. What's usually asked is, do you think the climate is warming? Do humans have a role to play, or do humans play a role in that? And you get very high agreement. In fact, I personally don't know anyone who works in this field who would disagree with those statements, but they're very general. If you then get to asking, do you think most of the warming is caused by greenhouse gases? Then the agreement begins to shrink. And if you say, and do you think this is a crisis or a problem that we should devote a lot of resources to trying to stop? Then the agreement is even lower, and you just get into the realm of active debate and people on both sides of those questions. So it's a research area, which means people hold different points of view and the data aren't clear, and that's why people argue about it. So what you do with the point you raised is there is very high agreement, obviously, on things like carbon dioxide as a greenhouse gas, and that compared to the 1800s, the world is warmer today on many measures, a little bit warmer. But are humans the dominant cause? And looking to the future, is this going to be a big problem that we should try to avoid? It's much harder to find agreement on those issues.
Mm-hmm. In fact, U.S. climate scientist Judith Curry had this to say last year: extreme values of possible sea level rise are regarded as so unlikely that we cannot even assign a probability. So, if you don't follow the crowd, I think what happens is you start to get called names, you don't get invited to certain high profile events to speak, you may lose funding. So, I mean, my question is, how is this in any way a scientific approach? I mean, normally scientists are, are quite, and maybe the scientists are, and maybe it's the media hype, I don't know, but I mean, I seem to recall that Galileo kind of unfollowed the crowd as well, right?
Yeah, it is a field, especially for younger scientists, it is very hard for them to dissent from what appears to be a party line in the field. And now, if you look at what they're publishing, if you look at the studies that are in the journals, it's like I say, there's points of view all over the place. And even within reports like the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, there's a wide range of points of view in there, and a lot of different conclusions can be supported based on the evidence that's in those reports. But as far as who has the dominant voice in the field and who are the people on the news every night and who tend to be the senior people on the government panels, that is a much smaller group of people, and they hold a lot of influence in their profession. And it makes me glad, actually, that I'm in the field of economics, not in the field of climatology, because I think it would be very difficult as a if I was a young academic starting out, I think it would be very difficult to be in that field just because of the intense pressure to follow the party line.
It would take an immense amount of courage, no doubt about it. Another frequent claim that is that all climate scientists believe climate change is caused by humans. And again, it's not that they don't agree to that, but to what extent, right? So let's pretend that, this giant, bright, hot, shiny object we call the sun might have a part to play too. Uh, there's certainly other factors that I think we need to take a very close look at, right?
Yeah, now that takes it out of the areas that I've looked at closely,
Hmm.
although I can say, just looking at it from a statistical perspective, that it's extremely difficult to identify long, slow changes in any data set. Yeah, the tools that we have for the length of data that's available for climate observations mean we can look at changes that happen on short time scales and try to correlate them with things that might have driven those changes on short time scales. But it is known that there are long, long, slow cyclical patterns and natural sources of variability in the climate system long before there were any cars on the road, or before people were using fossil fuels. We know that the climate went in and out of warm and cool periods, and it's there in the paleo record and the geological record. And obviously, those are natural changes. They weren't driven by greenhouse gases. So
Hmm.
trying to explain what caused all those, and we can't assume that all those factors suddenly stopped having any effect as of 1850. They're still active and they still affect the climate system. So this issue of natural variability, what are the mechanisms, what are the big drivers, that's an extremely important topic. I don't think it gets nearly enough attention. There's just been so much work
Hmm.
trying to attribute changes to greenhouse gas emissions. It's a lot harder to find active research out there on, well, you mentioned the sun and other sources of natural climate variability.
Yeah, that does make sense when you really think it through step by step. Now, after several decades now of alarmist claims, the sky is falling, the sea is rising, glaciers are melting, and so forth, at what point does society say, I cry wolf, enough is enough?
It is an interesting feature of public opinion surveys that despite the enormous amount of PR, the effort of environmentalists, but also of government ministries and government agencies, the public opinion needle hasn't really moved a whole lot. There's a concern out there. There's a general sense of concern, as there would be for any environmental issue, that climate change, we hear it's a threat, and so the public want to make sure that someone competent is looking at that and dealing with it. But as far as a public priority, uh, polls keep showing that it's at the bottom of the list,
Hmm.
and election outcomes keep showing that um, parties that try to push in the name of climate change, if they push very expensive policies that cost jobs or drive up energy prices, no matter what people tell pollsters, when it's their livelihoods and their job and their ability to afford the energy they need, when all that's at stake, their real priorities emerge, and their priorities are that they want affordable energy
Right.
and reliable employment.
And we've just seen that, of course, in our Alberta election as well. Professor McKitrick, one of my concerns is that we are perhaps teaching our younger generation that it's not okay to disagree with something that's politically correct, societal belief. Somehow this is considered extreme or hateful. We're told what to think and believe, but not how to think for ourselves. That's scary to me. Any thoughts on that? I mean, we see this in our education system, I think, in post-secondary.
Well, I can remember in school learning the fable of the emperor with no clothes, and it's told in a way that the message to young people is you should be like that. You should be the brave one in the crowd who's willing to just ignore the consensus of what everybody else is saying and just tell it like it is and tell us what you see and what you think. And and I'm sure that's still taught, and I'm sure in principle teachers want their students to do that. But then, as you've alluded to, when that actually happens, then suddenly we discover that society isn't nearly as hospitable to people speaking out against popular consensus positions. And maybe it's always been that way. I'm not a student of history, but I'm sure that there are just lots of episodes throughout history where there does actually emerge a very strong social consensus, and suddenly real debate becomes almost impossible, and very few people are willing to speak up on it. And I think the lesson out of those episodes is then you better pay attention to those people that do speak up, even if there aren't very many of them. Listen carefully, because if it's costly for people to speak up against a consensus, and they're doing it out of a sense of conviction, then chances are they have something important to say, and you better pay attention to it.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Professor McKitrick, and I appreciate your courage in taking the risk to speak out on this.
Well, thank you. My pleasure.
All right. Dr. Ross McKitrick, Professor of Economics at the University of Guelph, thank you so much for watching today.